In 1977, a Senate committee told 220 million Americans that butter would kill them. By 2014, that same butter sat on the cover of Time magazine under the words, "Eat butter." Number 19 on this list was the dish a Mississippi grandmother cooked for 60 years before her doctor told her to stop. She did not switch. Number 14 fed every American kid before 1990, then vanished from the McDonald's fryer. Number 1 on this list was the breakfast school children learned to fear. None of these recipes are banned by any law. These 25 dishes fed the country through depressions and wars. Then a Senate report made them illegal at the dinner table, and the kitchens that kept cooking them anyway were the only ones still feeding people right. Hit subscribe before this list ends. Here are the 25 banned recipes doctors now admit were actually healthy. Number 25. Pan-fried pork chops in lard. A cast iron skillet sat on a gas stove in a kitchen in Birmingham, Alabama, holding 2 inches of pork fat the cook had rendered herself. She seared the chops 3 minutes aside and let them rest under a folded tea towel until the juice ran clear. The lard came from the same hog the chops came from, and your great-grandmother had been cooking that way since 1928. Lard is roughly 45% monounsaturated fat, the same family that olive oil belongs to. Doctors in the 80s told you to throw out the rendering jar. By the time researchers in 2010 admitted there was no real link between lard and heart disease, she had been gone 12 years. The thing most people miss about a pork chop is that the fat is the flavor. The recipe was already in your hand. Number 24. Buttermilk biscuits with bacon grease. Every Sunday morning for 22 years, the same pan came out of the same oven in a parsonage kitchen in eastern Tennessee. The cook used a 1/4 cup of bacon grease folded into the dough the way her own grandmother had taught her in 1936. 12 biscuits, 12 cents of fat, 90 minutes from bowl to plate. By 1985, the church magazine was telling her to switch to vegetable shortening. She did not. The vegetable shortening sold in 1985 was 30% trans fat, the same trans fat the FDA pulled from the food supply in 2018. Bacon grease was never on that list, and the women who kept the bacon grease tin on the back of the stove the way their mothers had were the only ones who never threw a pan of biscuits away. Tradition outlived the warning. Number 23. Sauerkraut with kielbasa. A stoneware crock sat in the cellar of a house in Hamtramck, Michigan, fermenting cabbage and salt brine for 6 weeks at a time. The same hands that packed the crock pulled out the kraut, layered it with kielbasa, and let it simmer on the back of a coal stove until the sausage skin split. That was a Polish supper for a steel mill family in 1953. Doctors in the 80s warned about the salt and the cured meat, but the salt was the only thing keeping the cabbage alive. Lactofermentation produces lactic acid bacteria, the same kind dietitians now sell you in capsules for $40 a bottle. Her kraut cost 8 cents a serving. Her grandchildren grew up on it the way you grew up on Sunday dinner. The crock is still in the cellar, and the kraut still tastes the way the village taught her. Number 22. Cottage cheese with full-fat sour cream. A blue ceramic bowl sat on a formica table in a farmhouse outside Lancaster, Pennsylvania, holding a curd cheese the cook had made that morning from raw milk. She topped it with a heavy spoon of sour cream, a pinch of salt, and a few rings of garden onion. Lunch was 3 minutes of work. 40 years of dietary advice told you to switch to the fat-free version, and 40 years of dietary advice was wrong. The fat-free version replaced butterfat with cornstarch, gelatin, and sugar. A 2013 review in the European Journal of Nutrition found that whole-fat dairy was associated with a lower risk of heart disease, not a higher one. The full-fat curd you were told to avoid was the version your great-grandmother had been eating since her oldest cow freshened, and the bowl on her table looked the same as the bowl on your kitchen table. Number 21. Cast iron cornbread with bacon drippings. A black skillet sat in the oven of a country kitchen in Greenville, Mississippi, heating dry while the batter rested on the counter. The cook poured 2 tablespoons of bacon drippings into the hot pan, swirled them, then dropped the cornmeal batter in to hiss against the iron the way you drop a potato into hot fat. The crust came out the color of a copper penny, and the inside stayed yellow as the corn it came from. That was supper bread in 1947. By 1989, the recipe had been replaced by a sweet, flour-heavy box mix because the bacon fat had been declared unsafe. Bacon fat is around 40% monounsaturated, and the cast iron itself adds dietary iron to the bread. Every grandmother south of the Ohio River already knew that. The box mix did not last. The skillet did. Number 20, old-fashioned mayonnaise. 2 egg yolks, a teaspoon of mustard, a pinch of salt, and a slow stream of oil whisked by hand at the kitchen counter of a diner in Wilmington, Delaware, until the bowl held a pale yellow glass. That was Helen Tarkett's mayo. She made it every morning before the breakfast rush and kept it cold under a damp linen cloth. By 1976, the diner had switched to a jar from the back of a delivery truck because raw eggs were considered dangerous and yolks were the cholesterol villain. The 2015 Dietary Guidelines for Americans removed the cholesterol cap entirely, and Helen had been right since 1947. Her regulars still tasted the difference for 20 years and never said so out loud, because they did not have to. The jar never made it back into your grandmother's kitchen. Number 19, lard fried chicken. A cast iron Dutch oven sat on a wood stove in Greenville, Mississippi, holding 3 inches of pork fat a grandmother had rendered herself the week before. She salted the bird overnight, dredged it in flour seasoned with black pepper and a little smoked paprika, and lowered the pieces in skin side down. She fried them slow, never rushed, the way her own mother had taught her in 1934. The skin shattered like glass when you pressed it with a fork. The meat underneath stayed pink at the bone for 7 seconds before the heat finished it. That was Sunday dinner for 14 people, served on the same heavy, cream-colored platter your great-aunt had carried from the table since the spring of 1939. By 1985, her doctor was telling her to switch to a vegetable shortening with a label that promised heart health. She did not. She kept rendering pork fat in the same enamel pot, kept frying chicken in it twice a week, and ate the skin every time. Her cholesterol stayed exactly where it had always been. By the time researchers in 2010 reviewed the saturated fat data and found no real link to heart disease, she had been gone 12 years. The vegetable shortening her doctor recommended in 1985 was 40% trans fat. The FDA pulled it from the food supply in 2018, the same year the WHO called for a global ban. But lard was never on either list. The part the textbooks never explain is that the science was wrong from the start, and the kitchens that kept cooking the way they had always cooked were the ones that kept feeding the body the way the body wanted to be fed. Her recipe was already in her granddaughter's hand. The cast iron Dutch oven still sat on the same shelf above the stove. 3 inches of pork fat, a bird, a salted overnight rest. The science had finally caught up. Number 18, pot roast cooked in beef fat. A retired butcher in Omaha, Nebraska rendered a quart of sweet every fall and used it to brown a chuck roast in a Dutch oven before the slow simmer began. He added carrots, onions, and a splash of his wife's home-canned tomatoes, then let the pot tick on a low burner for 5 hours. By 1991, his daughter was telling him to use canola oil for the searing. The same advice you saw in every food magazine that year. Beef tallow is roughly 50% saturated fat and 42% monounsaturated fat. Canola oil from 1991 was extracted with hexane and bleached. He kept rendering sweat in the same enamel pot every fall until the year he could not stand at the stove anymore. The roast tasted the way every roast in that family had tasted since 1948. Some kitchens never lost the recipe. Yours might still have it on the shelf above the bread tin. Number 17. Navy bean soup with ham hock. A blue speckled stock pot sat on a gas range in a row house in Camden, New Jersey, holding a smoked ham hock from the corner butcher and a pound of dried navy beans the cook had soaked since the night before. The pot ran for 4 hours on the back burner. The bone went soft. The marrow slid out into the broth and turned the soup the color of weak tea. That was supper for a longshoreman family in 1957, and supper for the United States Senate dining room every day since 1903. Doctors in the 80s told you to skip the ham hock, the bone, and the salt. They left the canned fat-free version on the shelf instead. The canned version was 23 cents cheaper and missing every nutrient the bone had given up. The pot still ran 4 hours. Your grandmother kept stirring it the way her own mother had stirred it. Nothing about that pot had ever needed fixing. Number 16, beef heart stew. A retired truck driver in Akron, Ohio, bought a 5-pound beef heart at the meat counter for $2.14 in 1979 and trimmed it himself at the kitchen sink. He cubed the muscle, browned it in beef tallow, deglazed the pan with cheap red wine, and simmered it 3 hours with bay leaf, onion, and a splash of vinegar. Beef heart is the most nutrient-dense cut on the animal, richer in CoQ10 and B12 than any organ your doctor would have recommended. The supermarket stopped stocking it in 1992 because nobody asked for it anymore. He drove 40 minutes to a Hungarian butcher who still cut it for him the way his own father had cut it. He fed his grandchildren that stew every Sunday. They never once made a face. The dish that fed iron mill kitchens for 100 years quietly slipped out of your meat case while nobody was paying attention. Number 15, salt-cured country bacon. A wooden smokehouse sat behind a farmhouse in Madison County, Kentucky, hung with 30 pork bellies cured in nothing but salt, brown sugar, and black pepper for 9 days. The smoke came from green hickory split that morning. The bacon came out the color of dark honey and hung on a hook in the spring house through the cold months. A slice in a cast iron skillet at 5 in the morning was the first sound of breakfast for 3 generations, the way you remember the bacon hitting the pan in your grandfather's kitchen. By 1986, the warnings about cured meat had reached every home magazine in the country. But the salt was the only reason the bacon survived without refrigeration. The grandfather who built that smokehouse lived to 91. He ate 2 slices with his eggs every morning until the day he could not lift the skillet. The smokehouse is still standing. The hickory smoke still comes through the boards in November. Number 14, beef tallow French fries. A wire basket sat in a steel vat behind the counter at every McDonald's in America from 1949 to 1990, holding russet potatoes blanched in a slurry of 93% beef tallow and 7% cottonseed oil. The fries came out the color of a lion's mane and tasted, according to a generation of grandparents, like the only thing worth ordering at a fast food counter. A businessman named Phil Sokoloff had a heart attack at 43 in 1966, blamed it on saturated fat, and spent $15 million between 1968 and 1990 running newspaper ads against the McDonald's fry. In July 1990, the company gave in. The tallow came out. The seed oil went in. The fry was never the same. The taste your grandfather remembered was gone overnight. And the taste your father grew up with was a chemical flavor packet sprayed onto the potato during pre-shipment processing because nothing else could replicate beef fat. The science Sokoloff had used to win the campaign was a 1953 dietary fat hypothesis from Ansel Keys that has since been challenged by every major review of the data. A 2014 Annals of Internal Medicine analysis of 72 studies found no significant association between saturated fat intake and heart disease. The fry that fed 3 generations of American children was pulled from the menu the same year that childhood obesity in the United States doubled. The 2 facts have never been formally connected, but they sit on the same line in the timeline. What most people miss about that decade is that the company was right the first time, and the campaign that pushed them off it was built on a hypothesis that did not hold up. The fryer is still hot, the fat is back at a few small chains, and the French fry your grandfather remembered is finally being cooked the way it used to be cooked, 45 years too late. Number 13, whole milk yogurt. A glass bowl sat on a kitchen counter in Watertown, Massachusetts, covered with a flour sack towel and warmed by the pilot light of a gas oven, turning a quart of raw whole milk into yogurt overnight. The cook was an Armenian widow named Vart, and her starter had come with her from a village in 1923. By 1987, Her grandchildren were buying fat-free yogurt in plastic cups with strawberry syrup on the bottom. The fat-free version had 3 times the sugar and none of the butterfat that carried the fat-soluble vitamins through your body. A 2018 study in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition linked whole-fat dairy to lower cardiovascular risk. Vart had been right since 1923. Her starter was still alive in a jar in her granddaughter's refrigerator, the way your grandmother's pickle brine kept the same culture going for 40 years. Some traditions outlast the science that doubts them. Number 12. Cream of mushroom soup from scratch. A small saucepan sat on a coal range in a coal company house in Harlan County, Kentucky, holding a tablespoon of butter, a sliced onion, a pound of woodland mushrooms picked that morning, and a cup of heavy cream from the family cow. The cook stirred for 9 minutes the way you stir a roux to keep it from breaking. That was supper soup in 1939. By 1955, the same recipe was being replaced by a red and white can with a label that read, "Condensed cream of mushroom," and a list of ingredients no grandmother could pronounce. The canned version had 35% of the daily sodium target in a single serving and almost no actual mushrooms. The scratch version had real cream, real mushrooms, and real butter. A bowl took 12 minutes from start to finish, and the grandmothers who remembered both versions never went back to the can. The pot stayed warm through the supper hour the way every pot in that kitchen had stayed warm. Number 11. Lard crust apple pie. A young homemaker in Des Moines, Iowa cut a half cup of leaf lard into 2 cups of flour with a pastry blender at the kitchen counter every Saturday morning in 1962, then rolled the dough thin enough to read a newspaper through. She filled it with sliced Jonathan apples, a 1/4 cup of sugar, a teaspoon of cinnamon, and a knob of butter. The pie went into a wood-fired oven for 50 minutes. The crust came out flakier than anything butter alone could produce because lard's larger fat crystals create longer, more delicate layers in dough the way layered pastry sheets in a Hungarian kitchen create their own flake. By 1979, every cookbook on your mother's shelf had switched the lard for vegetable shortening. The shortening was made with hydrogenated cottonseed oil and was 19% trans fat. The Lard had no trans fat at all. The pie that won the county fair in 1962 lost its crust in a footnote, and the footnote ran the kitchens of the country for 30 more years. Number 10. Chicken bone broth. A stockpot sat on a back burner in a kitchen in Brooklyn, New York, simmering a roasted chicken carcass with onion peel, carrot tops, celery stems, and a tablespoon of cider vinegar for 18 hours. The vinegar pulled the calcium out of the bones the way a slow drip will pull rust out of an old iron pan. The marrow gave up its collagen and turned the broth thick enough to coat a wooden spoon. That was the foundation of every soup that left her kitchen between 1948 and 1973. By 1990, the same broth had been replaced by a beige powder in a foil envelope and called bouillon. By 2014, a bone broth shop opened on the same block selling the original version for $8 a paper cup. The recipe had not changed. The packaging had. Her grandchildren were paying retail for what your grandmother gave away. Everything old becomes expensive once it has been forgotten. Number 9. Sourdough bread. A glass jar of bubbling flour and water sat on a Pittsburgh kitchen windowsill in 1944, kept alive by a steel mill wife who fed it twice a day with a wooden spoon and a pinch of fresh flour the way you would feed a houseplant. She baked 2 loaves every Tuesday in a black-bottomed pan in a coal range. The dough rose for 14 hours, fermented by the wild yeast in her kitchen air. The fermentation broke down phytic acid, made the gluten easier to digest, and produced a crust the color of a violin. By 1973, the loaf had been replaced by a soft, sliced supermarket bread injected with 12 preservatives. By 2020, every cooking magazine in the country was teaching readers how to start a sourdough culture from scratch. Hers had been alive without interruption since the year her husband shipped out to the Pacific. And the jar on her windowsill never went cold for 76 years. Number 8. Chicken liver pate. A grandmother in Borough Park, Brooklyn, ground a pound of seared chicken livers, 2 hard-boiled eggs, a sweated onion, and a little rendered chicken schmaltz through a hand-cranked grinder bolted to the kitchen counter every Friday afternoon. She salted the mixture, pressed it into a glass crock, and chilled it for the Sabbath supper. A 100-gram serving of chicken liver carries 14 times the daily requirement for vitamin A, 6 times the vitamin B12, and more iron than any beef cut on the same shelf. By 1989, her grandchildren were skipping the pâté because the dietary cholesterol number on the label said 340 milligrams. The 2015 dietary guidelines removed the cholesterol cap entirely. The pâté was still on the same plate every Friday. Her recipe outlived the panic. The crock you remember from your grandmother's table was the most nutrient-dense food in the house, and nobody ever told you so. Number 7. Pork shoulder with the skin on. A retired iron worker in Charleston, South Carolina, slow-roasted a 6-pound bone-in pork shoulder in a coal-fired oven for 9 hours every Sunday morning, the skin scored in a crosshatch and rubbed with sea salt and a little black pepper. The skin crackled and puffed and turned the color of a roasted chestnut. The fat underneath rendered down into the meat and basted it from the inside the way a self-basting roasting pan tries to do and never quite manages. That was Sunday dinner for 9 people in 1971. By 1988, his daughter was trimming the skin off before the roast went into the oven, the way every food magazine was telling you to do that year. The skin she threw away was the part that carried the flavor and the fat-soluble vitamins. The crackle was the texture every grandchild remembered. He kept the skin on until the year he could not lift the pan, and the kitchen still smelled the same on a Sunday morning when his daughter finally put the skin back where it had always been. Number 6. Liver and onions. A young wife in Detroit, Michigan, sliced a pound of beef liver into half-inch strips, soaked them in whole milk for 30 minutes to draw out the bitter, dredged them in seasoned flour, and pan-fried them in bacon grease over 2 thick rings of yellow onion gone soft and sweet. She finished the pan with a splash of cold water and let the steam lift the fond off the bottom the way you might lift a layer of dust off a shelf. That was a Wednesday supper in 1952. By 1984, her daughter had stopped buying liver because the supermarket had stopped stocking it. Beef liver provides more vitamin A, B12, copper, and folate per ounce than any cut of muscle meat your butcher ever wrapped for you. The dish that fed working-class kitchens for 3 generations disappeared from the meat case the same decade that childhood anemia rates began to climb. The pan was still in the cabinet. Your mother just stopped reaching for it. Number 5. Polish sour cream meatballs. A grandmother in Hamtramck, Michigan, mixed a pound of ground beef and a half-pound of ground pork with a beaten egg, a handful of soaked rye breadcrumbs, salt, and a little marjoram, then rolled them into balls the size of a walnut. She browned them in lard, deglazed the pan with chicken broth, and finished the gravy with a full cup of full-fat sour cream and a tablespoon of fresh dill. That was a Thursday supper in a Polish kitchen in 1959. By 1986, the recipe was being rewritten in church cookbooks with skim milk and cornstarch in place of the cream, the way every old recipe in your mother's binder was getting quietly amended that decade. The sour cream was the entire dish. The skim version curdled in the pan and tasted like nothing. The original recipe is the one her granddaughter still cooks, and the one your aunt finally went back to the year the diet column went silent. Number 4. Steak and eggs. A diner cook in Cheyenne, Wyoming, slapped a half-pound sirloin onto a flat-top griddle at 5 in the morning, 4 days a week from 1958 until 1989, and cracked 2 eggs into the rendered beef fat next to it. The plate cost $1.90 in 1965 and $3.20 in 1979. Truckers, ranchers, and brakemen ate it standing up if every stool was taken. By 1990, the same plate was being labeled a heart attack on a plate by a hospital pamphlet on the wall of the Chamber of Commerce, and you saw the pamphlet pinned up at every truck stop counter from Rock Springs to Laramie. A 2017 review in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition tracking 135,000 people across 18 countries found no link between red meat or eggs and cardiovascular mortality. The cook had been right for 31 years before the science caught up. But the diner closed in 1991 not because anyone stopped ordering the plate, but because the rent went up, the griddle is still on. Somebody else is cooking on it now. Number 3. Bacon and eggs breakfast. The same plate landed on the same Formica counter in a luncheonette in Trenton, New Jersey, every weekday morning from 1962 to 1991. 3 strips of country bacon, 2 eggs over easy, a slice of toast cut in triangles, and a small glass of whole milk on the side. The whole plate cost 95 cents in 1968. By 1978, the American Heart Association had put bacon and eggs on a public list of foods to avoid for healthy adults, and your father quietly stopped ordering it the way he had ordered it for 15 years. The kitchen never stopped making it because the regulars never stopped ordering it. Whole eggs are the most bioavailable protein on any breakfast menu, and the saturated fat in the bacon was the same fat the AHA quietly walked back in its 2020 statement. And the luncheonette closed in 1991, not because the food was wrong, but because the rent went up. The plate had been right for 30 years. Number 2. Whole milk chocolate pudding. A small saucepan sat on a low flame in a kitchen in Toledo, Ohio, holding 3 cups of whole milk, a quarter cup of cocoa powder, a third cup of sugar, 3 tablespoons of cornstarch, and a knob of butter, whisked together for 9 minutes until the spoon left a path on the bottom of the pan. The cook poured it into 6 ceramic ramekins, pressed plastic wrap onto the surface, and chilled it until supper was over. That was Sunday dessert in a working-class home in 1964, the dessert your mother set out on the same chipped plate every week. By 1978, the recipe had been replaced by a packet of chemicals stirred into skim milk and called instant pudding. The instant version had aspartame, dipotassium phosphate, and tetrasodium pyrophosphate. The original had 4 ingredients and 1 pan. The grandchildren who ate the scratch version never asked for the packet, and the ramekins came back out of the cabinet whenever the grandkids slept over. Number 1. Butter-fried scrambled eggs. A small skillet sat on a low flame in a kitchen in Madison, Wisconsin, holding 2 pats of butter melting into a yellow pool. The cook tilted across the pan the way a painter tilts a wet canvas to spread a color. She whisked 3 eggs with a fork, a pinch of salt, and a tablespoon of cream, poured the mixture in, and pulled the curd slow with a wooden spatula until the eggs left the pan glossy and just barely set. The whole breakfast was 4 minutes long. From 1968 until 2015, the egg yolk was on the public list of foods that would kill you. The American Heart Association told you to limit yourself to 2 eggs a week. The 2015 Dietary Guidelines for Americans removed the cholesterol cap entirely. A 2020 BMJ study tracking 215,000 people for 32 years found no link between moderate egg consumption and cardiovascular disease. The breakfast that was on every dinner plate in 1955 had been right the entire time. Your grandmother had been right the entire time. The skillet is still warm. The egg is back where it started. At one time, if you strolled through a diner in the Midwest or passed by a county fair in Indiana, you might have found a regional favorite that's nearly disappeared from American plates: brain sandwiches. Typically made with calf or pig brains, this dish was born from necessity. Every part of the animal was used, and nothing was wasted. Brains, though delicate, were considered a delicacy by many working-class families, especially in areas shaped by German-American culinary traditions. The preparation was as straightforward as it was bold. Brains were soaked, sliced, dredged in flour or cornmeal, then pan-fried until crispy on the outside and tender within. Served between slices of white bread or on a hamburger bun, often with mustard or onions, the brain sandwich offered both protein and pride in thriftiness. For decades, it was a staple in certain regions, but in the 1990s, concern over bovine spongiform encephalopathy, better known as mad cow disease, changed the conversation. Though most U.S. cases involved older cattle, federal regulations tightened, and the use of brain tissue in human food was heavily restricted or banned. Fast food in the 1980s wasn't just convenient, it was an experience. Crispy fries, golden fried chicken, and burgers seared to perfection kept Americans coming back for more. But behind the addictive crunch of a deep-fried meal was an ingredient that would later be banned in multiple countries: trans fats. At the time, partially hydrogenated oils were the go-to frying medium. These fats extended shelf life, improved texture, and were cheaper than natural alternatives. Fast food chains relied on them heavily, not realizing or not admitting that trans fats were far worse than the saturated fats they were replacing. By the 1990s, research revealed the ugly truth. Trans fats raised bad cholesterol while lowering good cholesterol, increasing the risk of heart disease and strokes. Unlike other fats, they had no health benefits, only downsides. Regulators took notice, and by the early 2000s, the FDA began pushing for stricter labeling. In 2015, the agency took it a step further, declaring trans fats unsafe for human consumption. Fast food chains scrambled to reformulate their recipes, switching to healthier oils. Frugality reached extremes during the Great Depression, prompting homemakers to become amateur meat inspectors, carefully sniffing, trimming, and salvaging moldy or spoiled meat, hoping tonight's dinner wouldn't become tomorrow's medical emergency. While modern sensibilities cringe at the thought, families in dire poverty routinely carved away discolored portions, heavily seasoned questionable cuts, then cooked them at high temperatures to minimize risk, though the flavor sometimes left diners longing for less adventurous meals. Depression-era recipe books quietly hinted that spoiled meat could be resurrected by lengthy boiling or vinegar marinades, presumably on the theory that vinegar masked more sins than it absolved. Surprisingly, this wasn't entirely misguided. Boiling could neutralize some bacteria, though it did little to eliminate dangerous toxins already present. Eventually, as understanding of foodborne illnesses grew, health officials recognized consuming spoiled or moldy meat wasn't a test of toughness, but a genuine public health threat. Strict federal food safety regulations emerged, explicitly forbidding restaurants and stores from selling spoiled products and making it illegal to knowingly distribute unsafe. These next few items are really going to take you for a spin. I mean, we've had horses and turtles so far, but these really come into the top 3. Starting off with number 3, we have real haggis. If you don't know what this is, I regret to inform you, but it's literally every major organ of a sheep, from the lungs to the heart and liver. On top of that, it had suet, onion, salt, pepper, spices, oatmeal, and it was encased in the clean stomach of a sheep. Yeah, just sit with that one for a moment. So, a bit of good news. Even in the 50s, this was illegal. The United States Food Authority had banned the sale of lungs from any kind of livestock, and sheep were one of the strictest no-goes. This was even as early as the 30s and 40s. While there are technical reasons for it, I don't think you need anyone to explain to you why it's a bad idea to eat any of that. There were other versions of haggis made, just without the lungs. At some point, people kind of abandoned the medium of sheep as a whole. They switched to beef sweet, commercially available beef liver and hearts, and other organ meats, usually from pork. It was a Scottish curiosity to many, but it's one I wouldn't mind leaving unsatisfied. In the 1970s, canned soup was a kitchen staple. With just a can opener and a pot, you had an instant meal, thick, salty, and packed with flavor. But what made it so addictive? A little ingredient called MSG, monosodium glutamate, was the secret behind that deep, savory taste that made every spoonful feel richer than it actually was. Tomato soup, chicken noodle, cream of mushroom, virtually every variety had a hefty dose of it. MSG had been used in processed foods for decades, praised for enhancing flavor and making even the simplest ingredients taste more complex. Food manufacturers loved it because it masked the blandness of cheap ingredients, creating the illusion of homemade quality. And for consumers, it made canned soup feel more satisfying, even when it was mostly water and salt. But in the late 20th century, MSG came under fire. Reports of headaches, nausea, and a mysterious collection of symptoms dubbed Chinese restaurant syndrome led to widespread concern. While scientific studies later found no definitive link between MSG and health issues for most people, the damage was done. By the 1990s, food companies started reducing MSG levels and slapping "No MSG" labels on their products. Crispy, golden, and impossible to resist, French fries have been a fast food staple for generations. Whether served in diners, drive-thrus, or school cafeterias, they were a go-to side for just about any meal. But in the 1980s, some imported French fries came with an extra ingredient that no one ordered: malachite green, a synthetic dye that would later be classified as a carcinogen. Originally developed as an industrial dye and antifungal agent, malachite green was sometimes used to treat potatoes before processing. The goal was to prevent bacterial and fungal growth during storage and shipping. The problem was that this chemical wasn't designed for human consumption, and studies found that long-term exposure in animals led to organ damage and an increased risk of cancer. Despite these concerns, regulation lagged behind global trade. While the FDA never approved malachite green for food use in the US, some imported fries, particularly frozen varieties, tested positive for traces of the chemical. Imagine rummaging through a pantry full of unlabeled jars, playing culinary roulette with tonight's dinner. Exactly what many Depression-era families did with canned goods without expiration dates or labels. Back then, home canning wasn't just tradition, it was an absolute lifeline, with families routinely sealing meat, vegetables, and fruits inside recycled glass jars or tins, blissfully unconcerned about pesky details like expiration dates or ingredient lists. Dinner often became a surprise mystery meat special. Moms called it creativity. Kids might have called it something else entirely. Cooks would boil these unlabeled contents vigorously, hoping to reduce health risks, though botulism remained a lurking threat even then. Ironically, food safety guidelines of that era were minimal at best, and illnesses frequently resulted from guesswork gone wrong. Eventually, long before meat came shrink-wrapped with sell-by dates, families across America relied on a more personal process: uninspected home butchering. In the 1920s, it wasn't unusual for households, especially in rural areas, to raise, slaughter, and process their own animals. Hogs in the fall, chickens on Sundays, a steer if the family had enough pasture. The butchering block wasn't in a plant. It was often in the backyard or barn, with knives honed by hand and recipes passed down on index cards. Everything was used. Meat was cured in salt, sausages were stuffed by hand, and lard was rendered on the stove. Food safety came down to experience and tradition, not regulation. But as cities grew and populations became more centralized, the risks of unregulated meat, spoiled product, disease, contamination, became harder to ignore. By the late 1930s, the Federal Meat Inspection Act and later the Wholesome Meat Act of 1967 required all meat sold to the public to be processed in USDA-inspected facilities. Selling home-butchered meat, no matter how clean or time-honored, became illegal in most cases. In the 1970s, deep frying wasn't just a cooking method, it was a way of life. Fried chicken, onion rings, French fries. If it could be battered, it was dropped into a pot of sizzling oil. And that oil? It wasn't changed nearly as often as you'd think. Whether in diners, fast food kitchens, or even home deep fryers, the same batch of oil was often used for days, sometimes weeks, getting darker and thicker with every batch. Reusing oil wasn't just about saving money, it was considered part of the flavor. Each round of frying added something extra, building up that unmistakable, seasoned taste. Some cooks swore by it, claiming that fresh oil just didn't have the same depth. If the fryer got too low, they simply topped it off with new oil and kept going. But over time, health concerns started bubbling up. Studies showed that repeatedly heating oil at high temperatures could break it down, creating harmful compounds linked to heart disease and even cancer. Old oil could also harbor rancid fats and trans fats, both of which became dietary villains in the late 20th century. During the hardest years of the Great Depression, desperate hunger led Americans to pursue protein sources that nowadays would make your local health inspector faint, like bat meat. Although bats weren't common dinner fare, isolated accounts from this challenging era document people trapping and roasting these nocturnal creatures, usually out of sheer necessity rather than culinary curiosity. Preparation involved singeing the fur off bats, an image probably best left to history books, and roasting or boiling the meat thoroughly to combat its intensely gamey taste. Some Depression-era home chefs optimistically suggested marinating bat meat overnight, perhaps hoping to mask flavors described politely as unusually pungent. Humorously, no cookbook of the era prominently advertised bat recipes, suggesting even desperate cooks preferred to keep bat suppers under wraps. Today, however, American laws explicitly forbid hunting or consuming bats, recognizing their critical role in ecosystems as insect controllers and pollinators. Additionally, bats carry diseases like rabies and histoplasmosis, making their consumption extremely dangerous and firmly illegal. In the 1980s, alcohol wasn't just about beer and cocktails. A new wave of flavored wine coolers took the market by storm, offering a sweeter, fruitier alternative to traditional drinks. Brands like Bartles and Jamie's led the charge, appealing to young adults who wanted something light, refreshing, and easy to drink. But some companies took things a step further, adding caffeine to the mix, a decision that would later lead to bans and major health concerns. Combining alcohol and caffeine might have seemed like a fun idea, but it created a dangerous effect. Alcohol is a depressant, while caffeine is a stimulant, masking the feeling of intoxication. People drank more without realizing how impaired they actually were. This wasn't just speculation. Studies found that caffeinated alcohol increased the risk of binge drinking, blackouts, and alcohol poisoning. By the early 2000s, newer products like Four Loko reignited the controversy, leading to nationwide bans. But the issue wasn't new. The foundation had already been laid decades earlier with caffeinated wine coolers. Eventually, the FDA stepped in, banning pre-mixed caffeinated alcoholic beverages in 2010. In the 1950s, it was pretty common to see a certain ingredient known as bisphenol A in most canned foods. They were always in the linings. Now, the interesting part of this is that this was actually so adaptable that it went in everything from canned food to baby bottles, but it wasn't until much later that people got to know about how dangerous it was. Concerns had been popping up of women having hormonal or reproductive issues and children having issues in development. This was found to be linked to BPA. Apparently, the thing is an endocrine disruptor, which means it can trick your body into thinking it's producing more estrogen than it is. Still, throughout the 50s, companies were trying to make this the industry standard. After a while, they pretty much succeeded at doing it too. It got approved by the FDA and everything, but hey, we all have hiccups. Any Campbell's or Heinz products would usually have it, and lots of canned fruits also were built with it. Pretty weird how easy it is for this stuff to get around, huh? In rural America during the 1920s, protein didn't always come shrink-wrapped from a supermarket. It often came from the woods, freshly hunted and dressed at home. Wild game meats like squirrel, raccoon, possum, rabbit, and even bear were regular fare for families living off the land. There was no USDA inspection, no commercial processing, just whatever the rifle or trap delivered. It wasn't exotic, it was dinner. Preparation varied widely. Squirrel was commonly stewed, raccoon roasted low and slow to cut the gaminess, and rabbit often fried in lard or simmered in gravy. Recipes passed down through generations reflected regional tastes and the practical need to make the most of every bite. In many places, wild game wasn't just tradition. It was survival during lean times, especially through the Great Depression. As food safety standards developed and wildlife populations began to suffer under unregulated hunting, change became necessary. By the mid-20th century, laws were introduced to control hunting seasons, limit game harvests, and prohibit the sale of uninspected wild meat. Today, it's illegal in most states to sell wild game harvested by individuals, even if the animal was legally hunted. Kids in the 1980s, few things were more exciting than tearing into a brightly colored piece of candy. Whether it was lollipops, tamarind treats, or chewy sweets, candy was cheap, fun, and everywhere. But hidden beneath the sugary coating was something far more dangerous: lead. The issue wasn't the candy itself, but the packaging. In some cases, manufacturers used lead-based ink on wrappers or lead-glazed containers, especially for imported candies. Over time, lead particles leached into the candy, creating an invisible but serious health hazard. Children are especially vulnerable to lead poisoning, which can cause developmental delays, learning disabilities, and neurological damage. It wasn't until the late 80s and early 90s that health agencies took major action. The FDA and state health departments began cracking down on lead-contaminated candies, particularly those from Mexico and Asia, where regulations were less strict. Testing became routine, and by the 2000s, strict lead limits were enforced on all candy packaging and ingredients. Despite these dangers, candy never lost its appeal. Companies adapted, regulations tightened, and the problem slowly faded. Mornings in the 1970s often started the same way. Parents sipping their coffee, kids getting ready for school, and, in many households, children drinking coffee right alongside the adults. It wasn't unusual. In fact, in some families it was encouraged, especially in certain cultural traditions where a little coffee with milk and sugar was considered perfectly fine for young ones. Some parents even believed it helped build character or made kids feel more grown up. Coffee for kids wasn't just about the caffeine, it was part of breakfast. Some children dunked their toast into it, while others drank a watered-down version, often loaded with sugar. It wasn't uncommon for grandparents to pour a little into a toddler's bottle, swearing it would keep them calm, an idea that hasn't exactly aged well. But as health studies evolved, concerns over caffeine's effects on developing bodies became harder to ignore. Doctors warned that regular consumption could stunt growth, interfere with sleep, and even lead to increased heart rates. While coffee itself was never banned for kids, the cultural norm slowly faded. Today, it's more likely to raise eyebrows than fill sippy cups. But back then, a cup of Joe before school wasn't shocking. It was just part of growing up, one jittery sip at a time. By the 1980s, diet culture was booming, and food companies were on a mission to make everything sugar-free. From sodas to snack cakes, artificial sweeteners promised all the sweetness without the calories. One of the most popular and controversial was sodium cyclamate, a chemical sweetener that had already been banned in the US but was still widely used in other countries. First introduced in the 1950s, cyclamate was 30 to 50 times sweeter than sugar and far cheaper to produce than alternatives like saccharin. It quickly became a favorite in diet sodas and low-calorie desserts. But in 1969, everything changed when studies linked it to bladder cancer in lab rats. The FDA wasted no time, banning it in the US despite ongoing debates over whether the findings applied to humans. Meanwhile, cyclamate continued to be used in over 50 countries, including Canada and parts of Europe, where regulators determined it was safe in controlled amounts. Even today, some experts argue that the original studies were flawed and that the ban was premature. Regardless, Americans had to look elsewhere for their artificial sweetness, leading to the rise of aspartame and sucralose. Back in the 1960s and 70s, diet sodas were all the rage. Companies were racing to deliver sugar-free drinks that actually tasted good, and one of their secret weapons was cyclamate. Found in brands like Tab and Diet Pepsi, this artificial sweetener was 30 to 50 times sweeter than sugar, meaning just a tiny amount could make a soda taste refreshingly sweet without the calories. It was cheap too, making it a favorite for manufacturers eager to cash in on the booming diet craze. Cyclamate-sweetened drinks were practically a lifestyle. People who wanted to cut calories but still enjoy a fizzy treat stocked their fridges with them. You'd see slim cans of Diet Right or No Cal sitting next to casseroles and TV dinners, ready to be cracked open with a satisfying hiss. It was the go-to drink for weight-conscious Americans, and many swore it tasted better than the saccharin-based alternatives. But by 1969, the party was over. After studies linked cyclamate to bladder cancer in lab rats, the FDA swiftly banned it. The science was debated for years. Many argued the amounts tested were excessive, but the ban stayed. Before refrigeration was common and safety standards were strictly enforced, many American households poured their milk straight from the cow to the table. No pasteurization, no problem. Known today as raw milk, this unprocessed version was a staple in the 1920s, particularly in rural communities. It wasn't a trendy health choice back then, it was what was available, affordable, and often the only option. Families typically kept a cow on the property or bought fresh milk directly from local dairies. It was strained to remove visible debris, cooled if possible, and consumed quickly to prevent spoilage. In theory, it was wholesome and nutrient-rich. In practice, it could also be a bacterial time bomb. Tuberculosis, brucellosis, and typhoid were just a few of the diseases linked to raw milk during the early 20th century. The turning point came with the rise of urban populations, where large-scale distribution increased the risks of contamination. Pasteurization, heating milk to kill harmful pathogens, was introduced not for flavor, but for survival. By the mid-20th century, it became the standard in most states, with laws gradually restricting the sale of raw milk. In the 1970s, grabbing a cold soda meant reaching for a thick glass bottle with bold, colorful branding baked right onto the surface. Those logos and labels weren't just stickers. They were printed directly onto the glass using bright, long-lasting enamel paints. The problem was, many of those paints contained lead, and every sip from the bottle meant a potential exposure to toxic heavy metals. Lead-based paints had been used for decades because they were durable, resisted fading, and made the logos pop. No one thought twice about it. You'd twist off the cap, take a swig, and maybe even collect the empty bottles for a few cents at the local store. Kids played with them, stacked them up, or even used them for makeshift science experiments. But the real science was happening in labs, where researchers began linking lead exposure to serious health risks, especially for children. By the late 20th century, regulations started phasing out lead in household products, including paint, gasoline, and eventually soda bottles. By the early 1990s, U.S. manufacturers had moved to safer alternatives. Today, soda branding is mostly done with paper or plastic labels, but for those who remember the old glass bottles, they were a piece of pop culture, with a little extra toxicity on the side. In the 1980s, not everyone had the patience or the jaw strength for tough cuts of meat. The solution? A sprinkle of magic meat tenderizer, an instant powder that promised to turn even the toughest steak into something butter soft. For home cooks and restaurants alike, these products were a game changer. But what made them so effective also made them a concern. Many of these tenderizers relied on papain, from papayas, and bromelain, from pineapples, natural enzymes that break down muscle fibers. Used in small amounts, they were perfectly safe. But in the 80s, some brands took it too far, loading their products with unregulated concentrations of these enzymes. This led to serious questions about how much was too much. Overuse didn't just soften meat, it started breaking down proteins in the mouth and digestive tract, causing irritation and, in some cases, allergic reactions. Regulators took notice. By the 1990s, some countries banned certain high-potency versions, and the FDA placed stricter controls on their formulations. While meat tenderizers didn't disappear, the magic versions faded from store shelves. In the early 20th century, before the FDA had teeth and when labels made promises without proof, Americans sipped on something they believed could cure fatigue, liven the complexion, and boost vitality: arsenic-containing tonic waters. Though it sounds like the setup to a murder mystery, these tonics were widely sold and consumed by both men and women as part of daily health routines. At the time, arsenic was considered a therapeutic agent in small doses and was even prescribed by physicians to treat everything from anemia to syphilis. The most popular of these concoctions were sold under names like Fowler's solution or Donovan's solution, often mixed into water or other beverages. Some over-the-counter tonic waters marketed to the public even contained trace amounts of arsenic compounds, advertised as skin enhancers or appetite stimulants. A little poison, they claimed, was just what the body needed to feel more alive. The problem wasn't immediate toxicity, it was long-term exposure. Chronic arsenic ingestion led to symptoms ranging from skin lesions and organ damage to cancer. By the 1940s, the medical community began to understand the cumulative dangers, and public health agencies moved to ban its use in food and drink. In the 1970s, plastic was the future. It was lightweight, shatterproof, and perfect for everything from food storage to baby bottles. Parents heated up formula in plastic bottles without a second thought, and leftovers were stored in sturdy, reusable containers. What no one realized was that many of these plastics contained BPA, bisphenol A, a chemical that would later become one of the most controversial additives in food packaging history. BPA was used to make plastic stronger and more durable, and it did its job well. The problem? It didn't just stay in the plastic. When exposed to heat, like in a microwave, dishwasher, or even just warm baby formula, it could leach into food and drinks. By the late 20th century, scientists started studying its effects, linking it to potential hormonal disruptions and developmental issues in children. The public backlash came fast. By the 2000s, consumer pressure pushed many companies to phase out BPA in baby products, and in 2012, the FDA banned it from baby bottles and sippy cups. Today, BPA-free is a major selling point, but back in the 70s, no one thought twice about it. Once upon a time, no part of the animal went to waste. Pig skin and chicken feet were prized ingredients in kitchens around the world, celebrated for their rich flavors and gelatinous textures. Whether deep-fried into crispy pork rinds or slow-cooked into a hearty broth, these cuts weren't just byproducts, they were culinary traditions. In the 1980s, processed food companies found ways to incorporate pig skin and chicken feet into mass-produced snacks and canned soups. The appeal was obvious. They were cheap, packed with collagen, and could enhance texture in processed meats. But while home cooks knew how to prepare them safely, industrial-scale processing introduced problems. Food safety concerns began emerging as regulators took a closer look at unsanitary processing conditions and contamination risks. Chicken feet, for instance, had to be meticulously cleaned to remove bacteria, but shortcuts in mass production increased the risk of salmonella and other pathogens. Pig skin, often used in gelatin and snack foods, raised concerns over poor handling and unregulated sourcing. Over time, demand declined, and stricter food safety laws made large-scale production less viable. While still enjoyed in traditional cuisines, pig skin and chicken feet slowly faded from the world of processed foods. In American kitchens of the 1920s, few ingredients were as versatile or as sacred as rendered pork fat. Lard-fried everything wasn't just a cooking method, it was a way of life. From crispy chicken to flaky pie crusts, lard was the default fat on hand, prized for its high smoke point and rich flavor. It came from backyard butchering, sat in a tin by the stove, and found its way into nearly every meal of the day. This wasn't indulgence, it was efficiency. Lard was inexpensive, shelf-stable, and readily available from home-raised hogs. Frying in it gave food a golden crunch unmatched by modern oils. Cooks didn't think twice about deep-frying donuts, potatoes, or even bread in lard. It was Grandma's secret weapon and the reason your biscuits tasted better than anything at the store. But by the mid-20th century, health science began catching up. Lard was high in saturated fat, and by the 1970s, the rise of vegetable shortening and concerns about heart disease pushed it out of mainstream kitchens. The final blow came when many commercial lard products were hydrogenated, introducing trans fats. Those in turn became heavily regulated or banned. For centuries, fresh milk came straight from the farm, unprocessed, unpasteurized, and, at least to its supporters, completely pure. By the 1980s, raw milk was still widely consumed in rural communities and health-conscious circles, with some swearing by its superior taste and supposed nutritional benefits. But public health officials saw things differently, and eventually, the debate over raw milk became a battle between tradition and safety. Unlike the pasteurized milk found in grocery stores, raw milk skips the heating process that kills harmful bacteria. Advocates claimed this preserved beneficial enzymes and nutrients, but there was a significant risk. Raw milk could carry dangerous pathogens, including salmonella, listeria, and E. coli. Outbreaks linked to raw dairy led to serious illness and, in some cases, fatalities. Regulators took action. The FDA banned interstate sales of raw milk in 1987, and individual states began imposing their own restrictions. Some outlawed it entirely, while others allowed sales under strict conditions, often requiring direct purchases from farms. Despite the risks, raw milk still has a loyal following, with advocates arguing that modern hygiene practices make it safer. None of these recipes are coming back because of a marketing campaign. They are coming back because 3 generations of Americans were told to fear food their grandparents had lived on for 90 years. Now, I am not a doctor. This isn't medical advice. The next time someone hands you a list of foods that will kill you, ask who paid for the study and ask what your great-grandmother ate for breakfast. The kitchens that kept cooking the way they always cooked were the only ones still feeding the body what it asked for. The apology has been written. Most people just have not read it yet.